It was close to midnight in Toronto. The underground parking garage of Northstar Tech's downtown branch was silent, wrapped in the stillness of concrete walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed weakly overhead. Rows of parked cars sat quietly, their shadows stretching long across the floor. The city above was still alive, but down here, time seemed to slow, almost as if the air itself refused to move. Rachel Morgan walked alone, her footsteps echoing softly in the emptiness. She no longer looked like the celebrated CEO of Northstar Tech. Tonight she wore flats instead of heels, her blouse wrinkled from a long day, her trench coat unbuttoned and falling loosely around her. Strands of auburn hair slipped carelessly behind her ears, no longer polished into the precise style she carried for boardrooms. She looked like a weary contractor at the end of an exhausting shift hand that was intentional. This Toronto branch had been struggling, and Rachel had come unannounced, leaving her title behind to see the truth for herself. Reports could never tell her what she wanted to know. Numbers didn't show the heartbeat of people. So for days she had moved quietly, introducing herself simply as Rachel, blending into the background of hallways and conference rooms. Now, after hours of tense meetings, she only wanted to leave without drawing attention. But as she walked through the garage, she noticed something unusual. At the far corner, near the security booth, a faint, trembling glow pressed against the wall. Curious, she moved closer, her eyes narrowing. It was a flashlight, old and cracked, balanced awkwardly against a dented thermos. Its narrow beam spilled across a battered table, where a young man sat hunched over a thick programming book. His navy security jacket hung open, revealing a faded hoodie. Dark hair shadowed his face as he scribbled into a worn notebook filled with notes, each page bent and smudged from heavy use. He didn't notice her. The garage was so quiet that his concentration almost felt like part of the silence. "You always work under that light?" Rachel asked gently. The young man startled, hand twitching toward the flashlight. He blinked at her, standing quickly, clearly embarrassed. "Sorry, ma'am, I didn't hear you." "Yes, sometimes I study here." Rachel's gaze flicked toward the book that looks like more than casual reading. Advanced Python. He nodded once, his expression calm, though there was a quiet determination in his eyes. "I'm trying to finish a certification. I was in school before, but life got in the way." There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, only fact. She folded her arms loosely. "I'm Rachel. Ethan Parker," he replied. His posture softened just slightly, though his hands still lingered near the notebook, as if it were something fragile he needed to protect. For a moment Rachel said nothing. The sight of him alone, working late, clinging to knowledge under the glow of a broken flashlight, pulled her back into her own past. She remembered her father coming home after long days at the auto shop, grease on his hands, exhaustion etched across his shoulders, and still he would sit at the kitchen table, studying accounting textbooks under a lamp while her mother brewed coffee. As a little girl she would sneak down the stairs and watch, believing that somehow those nights carried their future. And now, decades later, she was standing in front of a young man who reminded her of that very same stubborn hope. She asked quietly, "What makes you push yourself like this?" Ethan hesitated, then shrugged slightly. "My brother. He's starting university soon. First in our family. I promised him I'd go back to do something better, something real." Rachel's throat tightened, though she kept her expression calm. Without another word, she reached into her coat pocket, set down a protein bar on the edge of his desk, then pulled out a small paperback from her bag, its cover faded from years of use. Algorithms made simple. She placed it gently beside his notes. He looked at the items, surprised. "You don't have to, I know," she interrupted softly. "But I want to." For a moment, their eyes met. Neither spoke. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. Rachel gave him a small smile, then turned and walked toward her car. As she opened the door, her voice carried lightly across the space. "Not everyone sees value where it stands now, but that doesn't mean it isn't there." The engine started, and Rachel drove away into the night, leaving behind the hum of fluorescent lights and a young man staring down at a book. Someone had given him someone who saw more in him than just a uniform. And though neither of them knew it then, that single night was only the beginning. After that night, Rachel found herself returning to the same corner of the garage more often than she needed to. Her assigned executive spot was closer to the elevators, brighter and more convenient. But she kept parking near the security booth at the far end. She told herself it was habit, or maybe curiosity, but deep down she knew it was something more. Ethan was always there, sometimes hunched over his notebook, sometimes flipping through pages with a pen clenched between his fingers, sometimes simply sipping coffee from a chipped mug, the flashlight flickering beside him. At first, she only stopped to offer a small greeting, nothing more than a polite acknowledgement. But over time, those small greetings grew into conversations. He was not a man of many words, yet when he spoke, it was with a kind of quiet thoughtfulness that caught her off guard. He never wasted a sentence. Rachel found herself leaning and listening, as though the stillness of the garage magnified his voice. One evening, she noticed a photograph taped to the inside cover of his notebook. A teenage boy in a graduation gown, holding a scholarship certificate, his smile wide and proud. Rachel glanced at it, then at Ethan. "My brother," he explained simply, noticing her look. "Liam, he's starting college in a few months, first one in the family to make it this far." Rachel smiled. "He looks proud." "He is. He worked hard for it," Ethan replied. His voice softened. "I just want to catch up, not fall behind while he moves forward." He didn't need to explain further. Rachel understood. In the nights that followed, their conversations expanded. They spoke about books, about coding logic, about the cheapest instant coffee that could keep you awake through long shifts. Rachel found herself laughing real laughter, not the polite kind she used in boardrooms. With Ethan, she didn't have to guard her words or posture. He wasn't listening because of who she was. He was listening because he cared to understand. Then came the rain. It had been a brutal Tuesday. Rachel had left a late meeting with her shoulders tight, her hair pulled back into a hurried ponytail. As she stepped into the garage, thunder rumbled faintly through the concrete ceiling. The first drops splattered across the open entrance, cold and sharp. Within seconds, sheets of rain swept in, carried by the wind. Before she could react, Ethan emerged from his booth. He crossed the space quickly, his jacket already unzipped. Without hesitation, he slipped it from his shoulders and draped it over hers. The fabric was warm, heavy, carrying the faint scent of soap and coffee. "You'll catch something," he said simply. Rachel blinked, startled. "I'm used to the rain." "You're not," he replied. Then he gave a short nod and returned to his desk without another word. She stood frozen for a moment, clutching the jacket around her shoulders. The gesture echoed louder than the signatures on any contract she had ever negotiated. That night, she sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine, still wrapped in the warmth of a coat that wasn't hers. On another evening, not long after, she pulled into the garage and noticed a delivery truck stranded at the wrong level. The driver stood outside, phone in hand, clearly lost and frustrated. Rachel slowed, but she didn't need to intervene. Ethan was already there. He wasn't responsible for deliveries. It wasn't part of his job. Yet he calmly explained the layout of the building, pointing toward the correct dock, then walked the man across the garage himself, flashlight in hand. The driver's shoulders eased with gratitude. Ethan nodded once, then returned to his post, damp from the night air, as if nothing had happened. Rachel watched quietly from a distance, leaning against the hood of her car. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but in her mind, something settled. He helped people not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because it was right. For the first time in years, she felt her world tilt not from power, not from deals or headlines, but from the steady presence of a man who carried kindness as naturally as he carried his flashlight. And she realized she was no longer just observing, she was beginning to care. The nights passed, and Rachel's quiet detours to the far end of the garage became routine. She had no need to go that way, yet she found herself drawn there after every late meeting. Something about Ethan's presence, steady and unshaken, grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. But Rachel was not only a woman moved by small gestures, she was also a leader trained to recognize potential. And potential, if left unseen, could fade into silence. One evening, she carried something under her arm as she walked toward his booth. It was an old laptop, one the company's IT team had long abandoned. The screen flickered, the system lagged. The machine was practically considered useless, but to Rachel, it was more than just broken hardware. It was a quiet challenge. When she arrived, Ethan was bent over his notebook, working through lines of code scribbled in the margins of a printout. His pen tapped against the page, his lips moving silently as if rehearsing logic in his mind. Rachel waited a moment, then set the laptop down on his desk. "I have a favor to ask," she said, her voice calm, almost casual. Ethan looked at the machine, then back at her. "This thing's ancient," he remarked with a half smile. "It is," Rachel admitted. "Think you can do something with it?" He studied her face for a second, then nodded. "Might take a while. Take all the time you need." She gave the faintest of smiles before turning to go. Ethan cradled the laptop under one arm as if it were fragile. Later that night, in the small kitchen of his rented apartment, he laid it on the table and began working. The tools he had were modest: a cheap screwdriver set, a second-hand toolkit, but his focus was unwavering. He disassembled the casing carefully, dusted the fans, realigned mismatched RAM. The software was bloated, the system sluggish, but to him it was a puzzle, and puzzles gave him peace. After hours slipped by. The city outside was quiet, but inside, the glow of the desk lamp reflected off the screen as he rebuilt the operating system, stripped away unnecessary weight, and streamlined every process he could. When he finally closed the casing again, the machine purred with a new rhythm, steady and alive. The next evening, when Rachel stepped into the garage, Ethan was already waiting. The laptop sat on the desk in front of him. "Runs smoother now," he said almost too casually, as if he hadn't spent half the night breathing life back into it. Rachel opened the lid. The screen lit instantly, no lag, no flicker. She clicked through the system. It was faster, cleaner, efficient. She looked at him with raised brows. "You rebuilt it." "I streamlined it," Ethan replied simply. "Kept the essentials, cut the waste." She blinked, surprised not just by the result, but by the way he said it, as though it were obvious, as though fixing what others had thrown away was second nature to him. "How long did this take you?" He shrugged. "A few hours. I didn't keep track." Rachel closed the laptop gently. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. Ethan gave a faint smile, but there was no pride in it, no need for praise. Glad it helped. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that this had never been just about the laptop. For Rachel, it was a measure of something far deeper: patience, skill, dedication. The kind of quiet excellence that could never be taught in a classroom or purchased with a degree. As she carried the machine back to her car that night, her thoughts were far from spreadsheets and quarterly targets. She had come undercover to evaluate a failing branch. But what she had found in the dim corner of the garage was something she hadn't expected at all. She had found purpose, and though the world outside still saw Ethan as just a night guard, Rachel Morgan saw something more, something that could change not only his life, but hers as well. By the next morning, a photo had surfaced on the company's internal chat board. It was blurry, taken from a distance in the garage. The caption was short, almost playful: "When being nice to the CEO means a promotion." The comments that followed were sharper, dripping with cynicism. "Security guard aiming high. Huh, another read. Must be good at more." The night shifts. Then, the one that cut deepest: "Sleeping your way up is a real thing." Rachel first overheard it in a hushed hallway conversation. She had been walking past two employees who didn't notice her presence until it was too late. Their words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and impossible to ignore for the rest of the day. She moved through meetings with a distracted calm, her mind elsewhere. That evening, as she walked down into the garage, she found Ethan at his post. He looked the same jacket, same worn notebook, but there was something in his jaw, tight and strained. Rachel hesitated, then forced a small smile. "How's the studying going?" she asked lightly. "Fine," Ethan answered. His voice was steady, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. She stayed only a few minutes, then left, the weight of silence pressing between them. After she drove Away, Ethan sat for a long time at his desk, staring at the glow of his flashlight. Finally, he pulled out his phone and began typing. I know it's not true, but the silence makes me feel like you don't believe me. He stared at the message, his thumb hovering. After a long pause, he deleted it. Instead, he opened his notes app and wrote quietly to himself, "Does she even see me? Or just the uniform?" Rachel, meanwhile, was caught in her own hesitation. She had been preparing something for weeks, a quiet plan to announce Ethan as the very first engineer in the company's new tech division, a living example that merit mattered more than degrees or polished resumes. But now, with whispers spiraling through the office, she froze. If she moved forward, it would look like proof of the rumors. If she delayed, Ethan would never know the truth. In her silence, she lost him. Days later, the HR team forwarded her his resignation letter. A single page, polite and restrained, signed Ethan Parker. Rachel read it twice, her chest heavy. That night, she drove back to the garage, finding his desk empty. The flashlight was gone. The thermos too. All that remained was the notebook. She opened the drawer and found the small book she had once given him, its pages marked with highlights and dog-eared corners. Tucked inside was a sticky note in his handwriting. Sometimes silence is louder than any answer. Rachel held the note in her hand, her throat tightening. She had thought she was protecting him from gossip, from cruel speculation. She had wanted his start to be clean, untarnished. But in shielding him, she had let him believe he was a lone dot, and for the first time in a long while, Rachel Morgan felt the sting of regret, not the regret of a failed deal or a lost client, but the regret of having hurt someone she had come to care about. Rachel couldn't let it end with a note. Not like this. For days she carried the weight of Ethan's absence like a stone in her chest, each meeting, each polished presentation reminding her of the silence she had chosen. One evening, unable to bear it anymore, she drove through the city streets until she found herself in front of a crumbling apartment building on the east side. She remembered Ethan once mentioning the cracked third-floor window and saying quietly, "That's home, not glamorous, but it works." The stairwell smelled faintly of dust and old paint as she climbed. On the third floor, she knocked softly. The door opened to reveal a teenage boy, thinner than she expected, his sweater loose on his shoulders, his eyes, though sharp, warm. The same as Ethan's widened when he saw her. "You're Ms. Morgan?" he asked carefully. "Just Rachel." She corrected with a gentle smile. "And you must be Liam." He nodded, hesitating, then stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was small, its furniture mismatched, but tidy in a way that spoke of effort. A stack of textbooks sat on the table beside 2 mugs of cheap coffee. Rachel sat down slowly, unsure how to begin. Liam spoke first. He didn't tell me much, just that he was working harder than usual. His voice dropped. "Now he's gone." Her throat tightened. "I never wanted him to feel abandoned. I never pitied him, Liam. I admired him more than he knows." The boy studied her face, his eyes narrowing, though not unkindly. "He hates being seen as a charity case. He thought maybe you did too." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, her voice almost a whisper. "I never did. I believed in him." Liam leaned back, his expression softening. "So does he deep down. But he also knows what people are saying." Rachel looked around the small apartment, at the stacks of notes, at the worn-out chair by the window. It wasn't luxury, but it was filled with the stubbornness of survival. The same stubbornness Ethan carried every night in that garage. She felt her chest ache when she left the building. The winter air bit sharply at her skin. She drove with the windows slightly cracked, the cold pouring in as if she deserved to feel its sting. The city lights blurred through her windshield, her thoughts chasing themselves in circles. She had wanted to protect him, to shield him from whispers, but all he had needed was her voice telling him he mattered. Now she wondered if it was too late to make him believe it. The search for him led Rachel far from the glass towers of Bay Street. Word had trickled quietly through the company someone had seen him taking night shifts at the docks, walking the perimeter alone, trading hours with other guards so fathers could be home with sick kids. It sounded exactly like him, steady and selfless even in silence. On a damp evening, She parked near the edge of the shipyard. The air was thick with salt and the faint reek of diesel. Cranes towered above her like steel skeletons, their shadows stretching across stacks of containers. A worker smoking near the entrance nodded when she asked and pointed down the line. "He's out there. Walks the whole row twice an hour. Never slacks. Kid's got heart." Rachel thanked him and walked into the maze of containers. The wind off Lake Ontario stung her cheeks as she moved through the narrow lanes of steel. At last she saw a glow in the distance, a small lead lantern flickering near a booth. Ethan sat hunched on a folding chair, a thermos beside him, a thick programming manual open across his lap. The sight struck her like déjà vu, the same posture, the same steady focus. Only now the flashlight had been replaced with a dim lantern. She stepped forward, her heart beating fast, and held out a folder wrapped carefully in a plastic sleeve. Against the mist, an official contract, she said softly. "Junior Systems Engineer at Northstar Tech. It's real, Ethan. It's yours." He didn't reach for it immediately. He closed the book slowly, resting it beside him, and looked up at her with the same steady gaze she remembered. "I felt like I was being tested," he said at last, "like you were waiting to see if I would crack. And when the rumors started, and you said nothing," his voice faded. Rachel swallowed hard. "I froze. I've been betrayed before, used by people smiling to my face. I thought if I stayed silent, I could shield you from gossip. I wanted you to walk in with your head high, no whispers. But maybe I chose wrong." Ethan studied her for a long moment, the mist curling between them. Then he said quietly, "You once left a protein bar and a book on my desk. You didn't explain. You didn't need to. You just did it. I remember everything." Rachel's lips trembled into a soft smile. "You remembered that. I remember. All of it," he replied. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had ever touched her. His hand was warm, steady. "I want this job," he said finally. "But more than that, I want this to be real. No more pretending. No more walls." Rachel nodded, her eyes stinging with tears she didn't want to let fall. "Then no more walls," she whispered. The contract slid into his grasp, but the moment between them was no longer about paper or ink. It was about trust being rebuilt, brick by brick, under the cold glow of a lantern in the dockyard. A year later, the streets of Toronto were dusted with snow. On a busy corner, sunlight glinted against glass and brick, catching on the silver letters above a brand new building. Rising steps, technology, and skills center. Inside, the air buzzed with life. Laughter echoed from training rooms, the clack of keyboards mixed with the low murmur of instructors guiding students. The center had only just opened its doors, but already it felt alive, as if it had been waiting all along for people to fill it. Rachel Morgan stood near the back of the main hall, her auburn hair falling loosely around her shoulders, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. She watched Ethan move confidently among a group of young trainees, answering questions, pointing to lines of code on their screens. His presence carried a calm authority, not loud, not commanding, but steady, the kind people leaned toward instinctively. Just a year earlier, he had been the night guard in a dim garage, bent over a programming book by flashlight. Now he was leading a development team at Northstar Tech and guiding the first wave of students at Rising Steps, people just like he once was, workers without degrees, without connections, but with ambition. Among the crowd was Liam, his brother, sitting at the front row with a laptop open, eyes bright with determination. When their eyes met across the room, Ethan gave him a small nod, and Liam grinned back. Proud. At the podium, Rachel's voice carried across the hall. "The center was built to remind us all that potential doesn't vanish just because the world fails to notice it at first, and no one knows that better than the man I'm about to introduce." She stepped aside. Ethan approached the microphone, pausing for a breath. He looked out at the audience, students, instructors, donors, old colleagues from the docks, even familiar faces from the company who had once whispered rumors. Near the front row stood Rachel, her eyes steady on him. He adjusted the mic and spoke. "A year ago, I was sitting alone at a booth, studying with a flashlight and a second-hand book. I didn't know if anyone saw me, or if it even mattered. But someone did, And because of that, I get to stand here today and tell you it always matters. Your work, your effort, even when no one notices, it builds something. And one day, someone will. The room broke into applause, warm and unrestrained. Rachel felt her chest swell as she watched him, no longer the quiet guard in the shadows, but a leader carrying light forward. That night, long after the speeches and handshakes, they slipped away to the top floor. Rachel's new office overlooked the Toronto skyline, glowing beneath a pale winter sky. The walls were lined with photo panels, images of people whose lives had already been touched by the program. On her desk sat a small framed picture, but it was the photo Ethan held in his hand that mattered most. A younger version of himself, hunched under the dim glow of a flashlight, studying in the garage. Snowflakes drifted gently past the window as the golden light of the office spilled across the photo wall. Ethan set the picture down, then turned toward her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he leaned forward, and Rachel met him halfway. Their kiss was unhurried, quiet, yet it carried the weight of everything they had built together. Not just a center, not just a future for others, but trust, respect, and love born from the faint beam of a single flashlight. The grand opening of Rising Steps was more than an event. It was the beginning of something neither Rachel nor Ethan could have fully imagined a year earlier. Word spread quickly across Toronto, stories of workers who had been overlooked, single parents juggling shifts, young people who had dropped out of school all finding a place where they could start again, classrooms filled with the steady rhythm of typing, the murmur of questions, the spark of laughter when a problem was finally solved. Each new face carried a different struggle, yet all were united by the same quiet hope Ethan once carried in the garage. And now, it was his turn to hand them a better light. Rachel often walked through the halls, watching quietly from a distance. She would pause by the glass windows of the labs, listening to the voices inside, students explaining logic to one another, mentors offering encouragement. For her, it was proof that the smallest choices can ripple outward into lives she would never personally know. One afternoon, she found Ethan standing in the main hall, his eyes resting on a mural the students had painted. At the center was a single flashlight, its beam spreading outward into a tree of branches filled with symbols of growth: books, gears, stars, open doors. He glanced at her and smiled faintly. They said they wanted to capture where it all began. Rachel's chest tightened, remembering the first night she saw him hunched under that fragile glow. "It's perfect," she whispered. Months turned into seasons. Winter melted into spring, then summer into fall. Rising Steps welcomed more students, and with each graduating class, more lives were changed. Liam completed his first year of studies, walking across the stage with Ethan in the audience, clapping louder than anyone else. And yet, through all the new beginnings, they kept the memory of that first encounter alive. In Rachel's office, the photo still hung on the wall. Ethan Parker, younger, bent over a book, a cracked flashlight his only companion. It was a reminder of what could grow from the simplest seed. On a snowy evening, much like the one when they had opened the center, Rachel and Ethan stood side by side, gazing out over the Toronto skyline. The city lights shimmered against the white haze, like countless tiny stars scattered across the ground. Rachel spoke softly, her voice carrying the same certainty as that night in the garage. "Sometimes all it takes is a small light in the dark, one that reminds you you're not invisible, one that shows you the path forward." Ethan slipped his hand into hers, steady and warm. "And sometimes," he said quietly, "it takes someone to believe that light is worth protecting." They stood there in silence, watching the snow drift against the glass, the hum of the city wrapping around them. It wasn't the contracts or the headlines that mattered now. It was this, the center alive with possibility, the lives transformed, and the trust they had built brick by brick, choice by choice. In the end, it had begun with nothing more than a broken flashlight and a man who refused to stop learning. But that flicker in the dark had grown into something neither of them would ever forget. Because sometimes the smallest light doesn't just brighten a corner of the night. Sometimes it changes everything.